This is supposed to be fun, right? And it's supposed to be actually a discussion, not a lecture. The newspaper got that wrong. Everybody gets it wrong. So Josh has given me permission to sort of blow him out or blow him off or whatever. Sorry about that. And so I want to start before I join him talking just a bit about this book. It's a highly organized book, the kind of book I hate. It's got a table of contents that's full of amazing titles. You could skip the book and read the titles. They're really fascinating. Across that whole structure, he tells us about these things. Listen carefully. Meeting, confluence, dialectics, distance, the infinite game, and interruptions. What you could think that you're hearing is a sequence through which creative pairs have to go in order to become creative. It's not that kind of book. It looks like that kind of book. So I'm going to take Josh, take you, to what I think is the center of this operation of Josh's mind, and light upon just one of these terms because I think it transcends the whole book. I'm going to let Eudora Welty kick us off, and she will tell you the term. I don't read especially well because I have a neurological problem called spasmodic dysphonia. I love having that problem because I like the phrase. It's a nice thing to say. We could say it together, spasmodic dysphonia. But I will make it through, make no mistake. It is our inward journey that leads us through time, forward or back, seldom in a straight line, most often spiraling. Each of us is moving, changing with respect to others. As we discover, we remember. Remembering, we discover. And most intensely do we experience this when our separate journeys converge. Our living experience, Welty says, at these meeting points is one of the charged, dramatic fields of fiction. I'm prepared now, she says, to use the wonderful word confluence, which of itself exists as a reality and a symbol in one. It is the only kind of symbol that interests me as a writer, the only kind of symbol that has any weight, testifying to the pattern, one of the chief patterns of human experience. And then she takes us to the last scene of The Optimist's Daughter, telling us about a man and a woman traveling by train south from Chicago. The narrator now speaks. When they were climbing the long approach to a bridge, after leaving Cairo, rising slowly higher until they rode above the tops of the bare trees. She looked down and saw the pale light widening and the river bottoms opening out, and then the water appearing, reflecting the low, early sun. There were two rivers. Here was where they came together. This was the confluence of the waters, the Ohio and the Mississippi. They were looking down from a great elevation, and all they saw was at the point of coming together, the bare trees marching in from the horizon, the rivers moving into one. And he touched her arm. She looked up with him and saw the long, ragged, pencil-faint line of birds within the crystal of the zenith flying in a V, following the same course down. All they could see was sky, water, birds, light, and confluence. It was the whole morning's world. And then Welty ends this amazing book called One Writer's Beginning. Of course, she says, the greatest confluence of all is that which makes up the human memory, the individual human memory. My own is the treasure most dearly regarded by me in my life and in my work. Here, time also is subject to confluence. The memory is a living thing. It too is in transit. But during its moment, all that is remembered joins and lives, the old and the young, the past and the present, the living and the dead. As you have seen, I am a writer who came of a sheltered life. A sheltered life can be daring as well, for all serious daring starts from here, from within. So I say that's Welty's gift to us, to Josh, and it tells us so emphatically what it means to be in a pair, which he calls a dyad, D-Y-A-D. Two people working together as if they have actually flowed together, creating this incredible something that not one could do by herself or himself. Now, other words in Joshua's vocabulary, just to quickly run through them, and then we start. Lovely lexicon. These are the words. Start of the book to the end of the book. Archetype. Knowledge in tandem. My students will start laughing. Eroticism. Dialogical. Relational. Two people animating the space between them. Dance. Creative intimacy. Enmity and comity intertwined. And there is, he tells us, no end to such relationships no end to such relationships. So the last of those first words was interruption. Once the streams come together, they cannot be reversed. Now to get personal and presumptuous. The two of us met 23 years ago in a college classroom.
I think it's 25.
25. And Josh claims that something happened in that classroom that is still in some way shaping his work. As soon as I said archetype, they reached a major climax with eroticism, and it got more interesting. So there's something dyadic about this crazy human relationship, and we're going to try our best to put you inside it, to help you understand it. So it's Josh's got that mic.
Thank you for that. Thank you to Angela and Nikolai for your warm introduction. Pat, thanks for that magisterial worded introduction. It's an excavation into the mountain of this work. And yes, very glad to be here with Pat Moy because our relationship is one of the models, one of the living models for me of understanding this thing we call chemistry, which is where this book began. A curiosity about this absolutely essential, largely unstudied phenomenon of creative chemistry. And this experience of two people, by virtue of their connections and intersections, and also by virtue of playing off each other, and sometimes by virtue of fighting with each other, how that can lead both to something greater than either could do on his or her own. And the question of what's happening in that moment that I imagine everyone in this room has some feeling for, feeling a little sharper, a little smarter, a little funnier, a little bit looser in someone else's presence. My question asking, where does that come from? How do we account for it? How do we wrap our arms around it? Because it seems at its core to be invisible and ethereal. That's where this book started. My first instinct was to look at.
I knew it existed between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. I knew it existed between Francis Crick and James Watson. I knew it existed between Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. But as I got into the research, I began to see that this quality shows up many places where you don't have a known partnership that are both sort of on the bill. As with a teacher and a student, where quite properly, I go on to have my own career and it's my name on the book, and it's not co-credited in any formal sense. Or in an arrangement where one person has an ongoing involvement with a company, with a creative enterprise, but his or her job requires being in the background, being off stage. And the most simple, both metaphor, it's literally true in some situations, and it's also metaphorically true in an enormous number of situations, is with a camera. When one person is on camera, there's another person behind it. There's another person who, for the structure of that shot, it's mechanically necessary that the audience not see that person. And so we see the star, and we only pay attention to the star, and we put the star on the cover of magazines, and we write biographies about the star. And over the course of time, the whole, this thing we call creativity is located within the body and with the person of that star. I think the literary term is synecdoche, where a part comes to stand for a whole, and we do that so often that we forget that there is such a whole, that there is this larger thing. And so that's why it is an actual surprise to us that there even exists this second person in many of these relationships, and that there is anything to study. And the project of this book was to pull that out from behind, to pull those partners sort of onto the stage together and to look at what happens between two people and to really drill down into it and to try to understand it as best we can. And I'll also say that the book begins with this phenomenon of chemistry and this feeling that people have, this initial feeling of excitement and interest. And what I found over and over again, the common characteristics of that moment of meeting is similarity and dissimilarity, which at first sounds really mundane. Of course, any two people are going to be similar and dissimilar, But what I found over and over again with these pairs that are going to go on to do great things together is that the similarities are so extreme that it's almost like they're identical twins in a way. It seems uncanny that any two people would be so much alike and so aligned. And at the same time, they are so dissimilar that it's shocking that any two human beings could, inhabiting a single space and time could be so unalike. And those two things are simultaneously true. And I could give you examples if you'd like to hear it, but the main example, the reason I cite it is that Hira was a 19-year-old kid in a freshman creative writing class at Harvard. I grew up in the suburbs, kind of extremely neurotic, Jewish world, upper middle class world, and just, one of these, one of a gazillion freshman kids at Harvard who, could barely keep his feet on the ground. I was so much in my head. And here was Pat Hoy, who then had on his books Lieutenant Colonel Pat C. Hoy II, retired, who had come to Harvard recently from West Point. So just radically dissimilar backgrounds. I, from the suburbs of Cincinnati and sort of this ancestry stretching back to Eastern Europe. You grew up in Arkansas and in a military family, and we're certainly, from other planets, and yet we had this alignment that I didn't really even know about. Pat taught me about the beauty of the essay and what the essay can do as a form. And I still think that what I learned in that class is what I've been doing for the last 25 years, or trying to do, which is to write a piece of sustained nonfiction that has at its heart an original proposition, an original idea. And Pat defined that for me, and that an idea is something that when you could be articulated in a sentence or two with clarity to the extent that any thinking person could grasp it, but that within that is a kind of complexity that it could be unpacked over 1,000, 10,000, in this case 100,000 words. And so I'm very glad to be with my creative pair on this.
Thank you.
On this lectern. Are we recording? Is that why you wanted the mic?
Yeah.
For posterity, Pat.
So, enormous differences on the outside. So if you tried to get into this relationship, into what made the creativity flow, you'd have to forget us, right? I mean, it's not Josh Shenk who walks around Jewish and peculiar and, you know,
I also
sometimes.
I had hair then. I had
Yeah,
wild.
you know, so here it is,
I can
and
imagine.
it's not Pat Hoy who came from wherever he came from. There's something much deeper in us that Josh is trying to get us to see. When I read this book the first time, first of all, my reading habits are intense. I read every single word. I take some notes, not many. I do check marks, check pluses, dots, periods, circles, arrows, and then occasionally I say ugh, right? And so Josh gave me 2 ugh moments in this book. One's about competition. I'm not going to talk about that. Don't want to hear him talk about it. But the other one, here's what happened. I started this book and I said, damn, I don't care about Lennon and McCartney. I was there, you know? Why do I want to hear this story? And he won me. That is the central overarching story of the book. That's really how the book is ordered. Okay. Then I start reading, and he starts talking about the dissolution into one another, into pairs, becoming indissoluble or dissolvable. And I say, this sounds like Tim O'Brien talking about love. Makes me sort of gag. You know, 2 people so intertwined, they don't have any distinction. And then this is where the ugh comes. He says, the self is not a self unless it's relational. So if I don't have you, I don't have myself. That's where I wrote it the first time. And I was suffering from this extreme anxiety because I don't work in creative pairs. I didn't think I did. I don't have celebrity. I don't seek it. So I'm suspicious of this whole thing. And then I watched Josh work that notion of the self. And students will laugh at this. He had 8 Venn diagrams, overlapping circles, to try somehow to explain graphically how this kind of blending takes place. Now I'm fascinated with it, and it's his time to explain it.
Sure. Well, the book follows a number of stories from beginning to end, including John Lennon and Paul McCartney. We see in the first chapter the moment when, as teenagers, they came across each other. John was in a high school band, and Paul, who was a couple years younger, came around because a mutual friend told him that he might get a kick out of it. And John was vamping and making up lyrics to old, not old to now old, but to then a kind of a contemporary doo-wop song, and just being this charismatic force that he was. And Paul, after the show, showed him how he could do these Little Richard songs and these Carl Perkins songs, and showed him what an aficionado he was even at 14 years old. So we start with these meeting moments, these chemistry moments, and follow a number of pairs all the way through from beginning to end. And we watch as they move through a series of stages that I identified, watching the sort of the natural history, if you will, of creative partnership. And it begins with this moment of chemistry, which almost every pair has pretty quickly, this feeling, very often a physical feeling of excitement, of elevation, of being different in the presence of another person. Although it should be said, and this is essential, that it's not necessarily a pleasant feeling. Very often, two people encountering each other who have enormous potential together will actually will feel put off by the other, will break into a fight, will think the other is arrogant or full of himself, or have that. But there's still this feeling of being different, being excited, and knowing that, I think, is important for us to recognize these moments when they come into our lives. The second stage, where the first stage can happen very quickly, the second stage almost always takes months, sometimes years to develop, is what I call confluence, and that is when two people's identities become entwined with one another in some fundamental way. It's very often connected to a moment of passage legally, when two people are doing a project together here and there, and it can be casual, but at a certain point you have to incorporate. You have to actually have some entity that owns what you're doing. So for John Lennon and Paul McCartney, that moment was when they had to sign a contract with a manager and with a publisher about these songs that they were writing. Before that, it was just John would do something and Paul would do something, and it was all informal and it was all okay. But at a certain point, they actually had to put down in writing what it was they were doing and who got what. And every pair at some point comes to that. And at that point, legally and more important emotionally, and very often in terms of in terms of your identity, in terms of the way the world sees you and the way you then see yourself, you become a part of something that you can never really disentwine from. The thing that's really important to understand about that moment is that while in some way you are entirely giving up yourself, and I think that to this day Paul McCartney is a kind of ghost. I think part of him existed only in Lennon/McCartney, and he can never get that back. It's also true that giving up of the self yields enormous gifts to the self. And so you really see, in a way, John Lennon and Paul McCartney ceased to exist when they had that moment of confluence, but it's also a moment of birth for them as individuals. And what we think of as the great genius of John Lennon, he said himself that if it weren't for the Beatles, and everyone knew that meant if it weren't for Paul, that he would have ended up like his dad. And his dad was a charming guy who moved from, job to job. He was a merchant marine. He jumped ship. He was a little bit of a drunk, and he was a charming ne'er-do-well. When John met up with him later, when the Beatles were getting famous, he was washing dishes at a hotel in London. And Paul said that his ambition in life was to be a college teacher, which you could very easily see him going down that route. And so and I think ultimately what's really going on in this book is that I'm trying to, and the thing that I feel like I'm most up against is a view of history that is linear and logical. The sense that, and this is the way that we ordinarily receive stories, is that you see a character and you see him or her move through space and time, encounter some kind of obstacle, transcend that obstacle, and then come to a new place. This is how almost all Hollywood movies are structured. And there's a book called The Writer's Journey that every screenwriter reads that tells you how to write a story like this. You have to have a character who's totally different. In fact, that's not the way human life works. Human life works as a spiral, where you are constantly coming around certain themes. And yes, ideally, hopefully there's growth and change, but there's this constant repetition and this constant sort of moving back and forth. So this is complicated and maybe beyond what we should be doing in this environment, but it was raised by your introduction, and I think it really is at the heart of this, that we're constantly set up to say it's the self or it's the dyad. And even my book is some way kind of pitched into the cultural marketplace as an argument against the lone genius, as against selfhood. What I'm really trying to do is look at the relationship between the self and the pair, and to see how they are dependent on one another, and to see how they create each other, and to see how this movement is a kind of spiral. In order to do anything meaningful creatively, and I will defy you to come up with a single example. A lot of them have been thrown at me, and I've yet to find a single example that doesn't fit this characteristic. To some extent, you have to surrender into a union. And one of my favorite examples, because a number of my favorite examples are the examples that are held up as the absolute, apotheosis of individuality, like Thoreau, who wrote over and over again about how important it was to be alone. And On Walden Pond is probably the most famous example about individuality. And yet he was on Walden Pond in a hut that was owned by Emerson. He literally was in the space of his mentor, who had taught him and guided him, and with whom he had a relationship that was fraught and complicated, and there were a number of breaks. But for him to come to his own individual sense required that kind of forming and that kind of meeting. And I also want to just say, I think it's really relevant to be talking about this relationship here at the Clinton School and on the grounds of the Clinton Center, because this whole thing arises out of a partnership of that sort that the public has a very, very dim understanding of. You constantly see this, really mangled, impoverished, immature presentation of that relationship, because it's just so weird for people that a relationship could be at the center of power, because it's so rarely talked about and very often actively kept out of the conversation. But it's always going on.
All right. Let's go back to essay. I watched some of you while Josh was talking, and he started doing circles, and my students started laughing. They were smiling across the room because it's one of my unending motions. I talk about Yeats' poem and the gyre and the spiral.
Yeah.
And the way it just moves, and that's what good essays do. Now, I want to go back to Josh's book. That's what Josh's book does. The book looks as if it's going to be, as I told you, a linear structure, but it isn't. It's moving back and forth and around all the time. Second thing I have to say about this book before we turn this discussion over to you eventually is that it's a massive accomplishment because he manages, I'm going to ask him, he knows I'm going to ask him this question in a minute. He handles probably 500 sources, maybe 1,000 in this book. There are hundreds and hundreds of quotations, and you can read this book without ever once having your pleasure interrupted as he brings all of these voices together over and over. So he doesn't tell complete stories about anyone. He's blending and weaving, and Jessica would say, braiding these stories together all the time. I don't know another single writer who can handle that volume with that kind of fluidity. Now, dance. You have got to talk about dance. He says at one place in this book that the theme song for this book could be "Takes Two to Tango." Why?
Well, it's number one, the song itself is best known through two duets. That's the most simple, superficial answer. But more fundamentally, tango is a very unusual dance. It's the most hierarchical of dances. It's actually an extraordinarily chauvinistic dance. The man is leading, the woman is following. Maybe that's subverted some places, but in traditional tango, that's how it's done. So there's just a very strong element of dominance and submission, and yet there is also an enormous amount of ambiguity in that the follower is actually teaching the leader how to lead, and knowing those two things together becomes essential for understanding power dynamics and creative pairs, which is a huge part of the energy, is the power dance between two people. Sometimes it's way out on the way out and obvious, and sometimes it's more subtle, but it's always called up, and it's always a factor in pairs as they come to a point of conflict, which is really involved in creativity and sometimes leads to disillusion. So one way that this plays out, to give you some examples to make this less abstract, is in a kind of competition of the sort that Matisse and Picasso had. And here's a great case of two people who are known as individuals, and of course were doing a kind of art practice that was immensely solitary. They were at their easels alone, and I'm not proposing otherwise. And I'm not proposing that there's a creative partner in the person who was putting the paint out on the palette, or who was, cleaning, preparing the canvases. But Picasso and Matisse came to know each other when they were both pretty young. Matisse was a bit older than Picasso, and one would set the standard and do something radical and unusual, and the other one would be very bothered by that person's dominance and try to top it, and do something that was even weirder and more interesting and would command the public's attention. And the other would be bothered by that and competitive at that and would move. And they did this all the way through their career, and they were very aware of it, and they talked about it quite a lot, that they were defining each other through this kind of interplay. And in a way, trying to beat each other and trying to be the one on top, and kind of coming to that clarity of power relations, which is something that we often think we want. We think we want to be the winner in any discrete competition, but and you can think about that if you're a sports fan. Of course, you want your team to win the Super Bowl or to win the World Series. Is there anybody who doesn't want that? But then imagine what would happen if you were the Yankees and you won the World Series, and that meant that the Red Sox were dissolved as an institution, that they weren't there to play the next year. You would be devastated. Of course, you want to win, but you only want to win in the context of that person being able to come back so you can continue to fight and play. And that movement between each other, and actually this motion I just did, this is exactly what Paul McCartney did in an interview when he was describing how he and John were constantly competing with each other. Paul said, John would write Strawberry Fields, and I would go away and write Penny Lane. And he said, it was like this. And then he said, we were getting better all the time. And whether he was consciously alluding to a song, the song I don't know, but that song is also a great example of how they work, because Paul had brought in the song, a kind of a classic Paul line, getting better all the time. And you could call it optimistic, but it's also this weird kind of optimism where he's clearly like trying to recover from some kind of struggle. There's constant imagery of rain and sunshine in Paul's music. He's not a relentlessly sunny figure. He's someone who's like trying to move into the sunshine from something that's very dark and sort of towing him down. So he comes to the song Getting Better All the Time, and John cracked Can't Get No Worse. Which is funny. I mean, for the younger people among us, it's actually kind of it's really kind of like proto-hip-hop, what they were doing. Like Paul would create the tune and John would rap over it. And he would rap over it sort of like working with it, but also trying to diminish it and undercut it and kind of give it a kind of darker, more interesting flavor. And yet, as with getting better all the time, as with Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, which was, issued as a double A-side single, it clearly, the whole was so much greater than the sum of its parts, and I think it's most illustrated in the breakup years, when you have two guys who are very clearly not able to reach the same height, and to the extent that they are able to reach the same heights, it may have been because they were still competing with one another. John Lennon came out of retirement in the late 1970s, apparently because he was finally fed up with Paul's success. Paul was king of the world at that time, and he wanted to get back on the charts. And had John lived, that infinite game would have certainly gone on. It was very clear that he was intending to write songs with Paul again and to play with him again when he was assassinated. And so the relationship goes on. I've gotten quite far from your question, but
That's what you're supposed to do. So I think probably a last comment from me, and then you have Josh to yourself. What he's doing for us in this book is making the invisible visible. It's a very hard thing to do. Let me try to give you an example of what I mean. 10 days ago, I started having amazing conversations with myself, right? So I drive back and forth to Conway 3-4 times a week. I spend a lot of time in the car. I had not seen Josh for several years. And I finished this book and redid this book and took notes and so on and so on. But that had almost nothing to do with these conversations. The conversation was with Josh and with you. And I didn't even know you yet. But there's something about that residuum of Josh Shenk inside me that still makes my head spin. He was a difficult student, complicated little sucker, and he was always trying to do something that stopped him, which made it just wonderful. Just stopped him, and he would get in these situations like this. He'd be in my office sort of down like this, trying to get straight in his head, and it was my job to somehow fix that. And I didn't know how to fix it. I hadn't taught Harvard students like Josh before. I'd been teaching future soldiers who were just as smart as the Harvard students, but they didn't have time to be smart. So you get in this situation with these exceptional students, and you know what? They all turn out to be exceptional. And it's that dyadic relationship that a teacher has with a student that you can't buy with money. And it lasts, in terms of a lifetime, it lasts about that long, 1 inch of time. And yet, it can in fact last a lifetime.
right.
And I'm not talking about what's going on in his mind. I'm talking about what he makes happen in my mind. And that is totally amazing. And that, when I say he gets at this undercurrent, the way minds find one another somehow minds and bodies. It's a bodily thing. You can't dance without a body, right? So that's the gift. Yeah. And the gift of this book is that it allows you to understand in a new way what this is all about. So you should ask Josh questions.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your questions, and I just want to briefly underscore how important that is, that creative thinking, if you look at it very carefully by studying and just choose whoever you most love, and in my case, one of the artists I most love is Paul Simon. If you look very closely at the way Paul Simon describes his songwriting, you'll see, but this is universal. Every creative person will talk about a kind of dialogue in their head. And if you really take apart what's happening in that dialogue, it is enormously resonant with the dialogue that happens between two people. And what happens in the world is the dialogue between what happens with a small child who goes from, 3, 4, 5, thinking emerges for the first time. Very small children don't think. Thinking is, first there's an exchange between the child and a parent or whoever else is around. And then at a certain point, that thinking, that exchange goes inside the mind. And that's what thinking is that exchange. And it's the same thing in creativity. And that's why a relationship like mine with you, though it had its intense and active period very briefly in my life, why it deserves consideration alongside these other partnerships, some of which were ongoing for 7 years or 10 years, some of which are 40 years, some of which are 2 years. The span in time is not that significant. The question is it significantly powerful that it then becomes a part of how you think and who you are? And I say that in part because I'm committed to trying to get to the truth of this story, and in part because I want people to understand that this phenomenon is omnipresent and enormously flexible in the way it manifests. And if you come away from this thinking, oh, well, there's Paul McCartney and John Lennon and then the rest of us, that's not the right lesson. This is something that can be experienced by all people and at all levels and in all kinds of ways, some of which are obvious and some of which are more subtle. But tuning into it, I really think, can be helpful to all of us. It's been helpful for me.
Footnote, I started to begin my presentation by referring to a Paul Simon song in which a guy and a gal are in a taxi headed to a party, chatting one another up, and they're supposedly having a conversation. But at the end of each person's comment, we get a refrain. There is no conversation. And that's the joke of the piece. And this is just the opposite of that. Just the opposite. My students also laughing because last week we spent too much time on Graceland. Too much time on Graceland.
Never too much time on Graceland. Do you have a question, sir? Or you're handling the mic for anyone who has
raise
a
your
question.
hand. Raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you.
Someone's got to be first.
Here we go.
In the back.
Did you happen to see when you're studying this many situations or any notable ones where people were rarely physically together, like Lennon and McCartney were always together, maybe doing it more via long distance,
Yes.
phone, whatever?
Yeah, that's very common. Every connection, every partnership has to find the right degree of intertwinement and the right degree of distance. And one of the factors in distance is, well, there's psychological factors. There's also simple geography. And it's very common that what works for two people is actually to be quite far apart. So briefly mention a pair of architects in my book who have a practice that is based in London and in San Francisco, and they interact by Skype. One of them actually has the bulk of the office with her in London, and the other works from her home in San Francisco, and they constantly travel and they see each other a fair amount, and they are on Skype every day. But then I said to her, when you're on Skype, do you have the video on? And she said, never. That would be too much. You know, I want to wander around. I don't want her to be seeing my face. And also, she said, we're looking at the project very often, so that's what's on the screen, is the schematics or whatnot. And if you pay attention to any partnership, what might on the surface look like, you know, a fantastic distance or constant entwinement turns out to be a dance between the two. So Lennon and McCartney had a rhythm, a kind of that's stretched through the year. There'd be periods where they'd be off doing whatever they wanted, and there'd be periods where they would be working. So that's one rhythm. But then within those working periods, there would be parts of the day where they were on their own, and there'd be parts of the day when they were together. They would get together usually about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They would write all afternoon, and then about 7 o'clock they would go to the studio. They would stay in the studio till 2 or 3, and then very often would have separate lives after that. John would often go back to the suburbs where he lived, and Paul would go clubbing, and then they would come around together again the next day at 2. And so this is another place where people think, oh, well, I'm not part of a creative pair. I'm a writer. You know, I work alone. But very often the people who depend on the most solitude in terms of their practice, they're very often the most dependent on the energy of another person, the way a writer is on a literary agent or an editor or a teacher. So there's not a disequal sign, an unequal sign between solitude and connection. It's actually another one of these circles, that the right kind of solitude and knowing who you are and what you're about sets you up for a good connection, and the right kind of connection will bring you back into solitude. Thanks for that question.
Right over here.
Is there a point where that creativity either becomes enabling to one or becomes unhealthy, and does either partner know that, or does it take care of itself?
Well, so you use the word enabling, and it's so enabling it's really become deeply laden with the idea of one person doing for another person in such a way that hurts them both. I mean, I don't know I associate it with Al-Anon. Maybe it has another part, other sort of roots in the culture. I think it's telling that so many of our words for interdependence actually are associated with pathology. Codependence is a classic example. And I think that reflects a kind of a larger cultural poverty around understanding relationships and how integral they are. That said, of course, it is often true that a relationship can run into trouble when things aren't carefully delineated, and where that rises to salience in my book is through the discussion of roles. In every connection, in every partnership, there needs to be a pretty specific delineation of who does what, and each person needs to be radically responsible for that, for his or her piece, which sometimes is like a specific body of work, and sometimes it's just like a moment in time. An example of it being a specific body of work is with a writer and an editor. An editor can support and facilitate, and you can hash out ideas, all day, but at a certain point, the writer's got to go and produce a draft for that editor to respond to. And in my relationship with my editor that was so integral to this book, I mean, he was always very clear. He was never going to generate ideas. He was never going to type up a summation of a conversation he and I just had for me to then work from as notes towards writing a draft. It was, you get me something to respond to. And had I said to him, as I did. You know, I can't do this because I need more from you. He would say, well, I can't do what you need until you show up. And so that kind of clarity about individual responsibility is important. And when things get fuzzy, you will see trouble. I think there's a question over here.
Go.
As Pat said, making the invisible visible, I'm just wondering how articulating these ideas and exploring them in this book have changed the way you think about and engage with relationships in your own life.
Profoundly, but not with any, but not with any, not with enormous clarity. I mean, because there is, I think, knowing the principles of the book all the way through is very much like knowing about how a guitar works and how it can be tuned. That there are a series of strings, actually 6 strings and 6 themes, so that fits. I never thought of that. And that it can be, if the string is basically on right, and if the instrument is basically in the right kind of shape, it's either going to be sharp or flat. And you're going to need to move the knob in one direction or another after you pluck the string, after you hear it. So in my life, I am constantly plucking that string and looking what needs to happen now. And very often what needs to happen in a micro or a macro is more solitude. So I have now started to get I try to be very clear about my day, and when I turn off the phone, ideally it really goes off and not just like, oh, I'm turning that off, but like physically off in another room. And when I use the app on the Mac called Freedom, which disables the internet for X number of minutes. And there's a cool new feature on the new version of Freedom that allows you to set that every day. So you set up a schedule so that at 2 o'clock every day it goes off. And you don't have to make the decision every day. And I found, I live on the West Coast, I live in Los Angeles, and I found that the afternoon is a great time for me to not just be like physically alone, but psychologically alone, because the East Coast has gone home, after 2 o'clock. And I also know that what some writers are able to do, I'm really not able to do and work well, which is to try to be alone the whole day or for a whole week or for a whole month. Ideally, my morning is full of conversations, and ideally I actually see someone, because I work at home. It's easy for me to not see anybody, but the days that are most effective are days when, I'm on email and doing what I need to do in the morning and actually meet someone for lunch, and then I come back at 12:30 or 1 o'clock and I have that whole unbroken afternoon. So I think about everything in terms of relationships, but I'm also thinking more and more, I also think about what do I need to do? If John Lennon hadn't gotten up on that stage, which was an enormously daring thing to do for a 17-year-old, and vamp to these doo-wop songs and sing, sort of play Elvis, if he hadn't felt from within him and from the sources that he gathered from the culture, this impulse and this drive, and done this very distinct, idiosyncratic thing, he never would have met Paul. So it does begin with with showing up with who you are and what you want and taking that risk. And then that leads to the relationship, and the relationship leads you back to the self. And so I hope I'm giving you some flavor of how, I think about this all the time, but it's different in every moment, and it's different for every person. And I couldn't tell you, maybe I could if we talk for a while, like what you should do, because it may be that what you need to do is really rethink. Like some people, in order to be creative, you need to rethink, what field do you even want to be in? Like what brings you pleasure? And some people are basically on the right track in a lot of ways, but are never going to be activated until they take the leap into a relationship. You hear this all the time among writers who are beginning writers, and it's funny because you never hear it among professional writers. They say, well, I don't want to tell you my idea because I'm a little worried, that you're going to take it. But professional writers know, listen, the idea is not the hard part, buddy. You know, the hard part's going to be getting it done. So let them, you know, let's talk about it, and you know, release that into a place of, you know, collegiality, and that's the only way it's going to get to the next stage.
We have time for one more. Bob, Katie.
Thanks for coming. I get to teach creative collaboration in teams, and that's really interesting. So what I hear themes that you're saying come out are about authenticity plus vulnerability. So you have very authentic people coming to the table who are also willing to be vulnerable. So that sounds important. And when we're talking about creative collaboration, for us, we teach yes and communities, right? Like
Yes.
constantly saying yes, and I'm adding to your idea. But I hear you maybe talking about no buts more, that when we delineate the roles, that it's okay to say, this is my role, and sometimes taking ideas back. I wonder just what your thoughts are about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, number one, I love that authenticity plus vulnerability. That does very neatly capture these two qualities that are absolutely necessary and need to be joined. And I am familiar with this idea of yes and I think it's a great principle. And it's the kind of feminine principle. It's sort of warming, welcoming. I don't mean feminine in the sense of female. I mean in the archetypal energies. I imagine most of you get that. But yes, this is always present in great pairs. There's a sense of openness. There's a sense that you won't be shamed, I think is critical. There's a sense that you know, the internal censor that for most of us is operating almost all the time in order to gauge, can I say this, can I do this, that will disappear. And I think that arises out of a feeling of great safety, which can be engendered by a yes and culture. At the same time, you do see enormous distinction and clarity and sort of individual responsibility in these effective partnerships. And one of the reasons why the pair is an unusual unit is that it's very, very clear in a pair and it can become dissipated in a group. And there's a formal kind of sociological argument for what happens when you add a third person to the group. Suddenly any individual is no longer responsible for the group's sustenance or failure, and therefore almost like metabolically, like your contribution changes. Whereas when you're in when there are two people, if one person stops showing up, the entity ceases to exist. And that's one of the reasons why you very often see in the context of big groups like Monty Python, the writing actually happened in a series of dyads that would break off from the group and then return to the group. And why you see something like the Beatles, you see John Lennon and Paul McCartney going off and writing the songs and bringing it back to the group. So yeah, I do think that both are necessary. And again, it's the kind of thing where I think you see the yes and thing emphasized, and especially I imagine in a corporate environment, because people are so used to this other way of being, and they really need correction. And they don't understand that people aren't contributing in part because they're scared and they're really only going to come out of their shells if they are encouraged. But, you know, left to its extreme, it becomes like that Simpsons episode where Bart says, I don't know, I just feel like it. And then the whole town just starts doing that. And then one day the Ferris wheel comes off its hinges and rolls through town and flattens. And the guy who operates the Ferris wheel says, well, I don't know, I just didn't feel like doing it. And because everyone is being like Bart, obviously society can't work that way and creativity can't happen that way.
Well, thank you all for coming out this evening. Eric, thank you for connecting Joshua to the school, and Pat for convincing him to come to the literary festival and then making this all happen. So let's thank Josh and Pat for that great discussion. And I know that there's still some more questions. His brand new paperback of a couple of days
That's right.
is available over here, and he'll be signing copies of that as well.
Thanks again. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you.